So as of now, the meeting is being recorded. I'm Anna Winokur. I'm with the Florida PBS Project, and I'm here with.
I'm Chris Vatland, and I'm also with the PBIS project.
And the topic of our chat this afternoon is verbal de-escalation. Although we will be covering prevention and also what to do after a crisis might happen. We are going to attempt to show some videos, and if we find that at the very first try we're not able to successfully do that, we're not going to make you sit and watch us try to figure that part out. We think we've got it accomplished, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a warning ahead of time. But our objectives for this afternoon are, one, to identify resources to support classrooms to prevent a crisis situation. We want to also identify some strategies for faculty and staff to address triggers in both themselves and in students. And then, of course, we want to have some strategies to de-escalate problem behavior. So before we get started, we just want to do a disclaimer. The information in this presentation is not intended to replace your school or your district's crisis plan, and it's not meant to be a comprehensive training. It's really meant to just provide some awareness. An additional formal training should occur with all of your teachers and the adults on your school campus, along with practice and coaching. So we just wanted to make sure that folks knew that once you leave, there's some ideas and some resources, but it's not meant to replace any type of formal training that you might need to do within your district. The other piece before we get started too, if you don't mind just typing in the chat box, when you are thinking about what your role is when it comes to if there is a crisis situation at your school, are you part of that team? Are you somebody who provides coaching supports to teachers as they're trying to deal with that type of situation? Are you the teacher who would be responsible for implementing some of these strategies? If you don't mind just typing in the chat box and indicate what would be your responsibilities if we're going to be talking about the crisis cycle today. Where do you see yourself fitting in? Okay, so I see we have a coach, so somebody who's providing supports to teachers. Another coach, good. All right, great, wonderful. And all right, classroom teacher, good. All right, so we have a lot of people who will be providing supports and also teachers who would be utilizing those supports that are provided. Okay, so we have some counselors as well. And more teachers. All right, terrific. So that's really, we had exactly this audience in mind, largely when we were thinking about what would be the most useful for this presentation. So while the title of the chat is verbal de-escalation, we know that there's other parts, right, across the cycle that happen even before that. So really the way we're framing the whole presentation is thinking about the different stages of the crisis cycle. So starting with what do we do to make sure things do stay calm, but what can we do if there does seem to be some agitation? Followed by what do we do when we see student behavior escalating? What happens when we are in that crisis mode or the behavior is peaking? And then what can we do to de-escalate a crisis situation, and what are we going to do after it's over? And then how can we make sure that we're being as preventative as possible so we stay in that calm space for the majority of the time. So that's what this diagram is really trying to demonstrate for you. When we're thinking about the stages, we want to make sure that we're staying in that A spot that's on your screen, that light blue spot, where our students are coming in and they are calm. And if they do appear to be agitated, we do have some strategies where we can get them as fast as we can back to that calm area. But of course, we know that there's going to be times where behavior does escalate, but that should be few. We shouldn't see that happening on a consistent basis. And if we do, then maybe we need to rethink what some of our preventative strategies are. And then, of course, when we're thinking of the crisis and the peak, that should happen less than 1% of the time. So if you're thinking about classrooms that you support where you're there either consistently throughout the week or throughout the day, and they're spending a lot of time here in this red tip part, then the next couple of slides that we're going to share might help you to support teachers, or if you're the teacher yourself, support students in keeping in the calm cycle for as long as possible. Okay, so just type in the chat box if this sounds familiar to you at all. In the calm stage, Tasha had a great lunch. She enters the classroom, she sits at her desk, and she's ready. But Miss Johnston tells the class that the schedule's changed and they're going to be working on a math concept. And this is something that Tasha has struggled with before. So that's sort of a trigger for her. So she starts to get agitated. She puts her head down. And in response to that, Miss Johnston yells at her to get her head up and get started. In response to what Miss Johnston said, Tasha then rips up her paper and throws her pencil. So now her behavior is really escalating. And the response that she receives from the adult in the room is to move to the back. So to get to the back of the room because she's ripped up her paper and she's thrown her pencil. So Tasha stands up, she knocks over her desk, and she throws her book in the middle of the class. And Miss Johnston's saying to the administrator, I don't know what to do, she's out of control. Does that sound like a familiar situation to anybody? Yes. Okay, good. Not that we want to see this, but I thought this might be something that we could all relate to. We've all either maybe been in that moment where we responded the way we didn't quite want to, or we might also have seen this happen when we're watching other adult behavior. Okay, so I asked you already, what was your role in supporting the crisis situation? And I'm so worried about forgetting that, I asked it ahead of the game. So what we're going to talk about for the next couple of slides is that prevention piece. And we need to make sure, just like we do with almost everything that we're thinking of around behavior, that we're trying to put as many things in place so that we are staying in that calm stage about 90 to 98% of the time. So when I walk into a classroom and students are in the calm phase, I would expect to see things like they're following classroom rules, they're following procedures, they're interacting in a positive manner with both their peers and adults, they're cooperative, they're engaged. What else might you see if you walked into a classroom and students were in the calm phase? Go ahead and type in the chat box. Is there anything else you might expect to see that would let you know that everything's pretty much running smoothly here? Maybe I captured everything. Okay, I see Paige's typing, and so is Kelly. Just some additional ideas. And I'll just wait a second so we can see what their response. Right, volume's relatively low level. Excellent point. So you're not walking into something that sounds chaotic. Students are asking questions. Great, they're engaged. Yes, they're smiling. They're in the slant position, so we know that they're listening, they're attending. They're doing those, engaging in those kinds of behaviors that demonstrate that they are on task and ready to learn. So this right here really describes, and I think this would be a really good resource for you all to share too with other faculty and staff, is what we're calling here the behavioral iceberg. So at the top, this is what we actually see, right? We see a child who hits his head with his hand, maybe he bangs his head against the wall, maybe he's poking other people in the eye, or he's pulling his hair. We're seeing behaviors that are indicating to us that they're not being safe, either to themselves or to somebody else. But this is only what we're seeing. Underneath that, we know that there might be some more things going on than just what meets the eye. So maybe they're really having trouble understanding what's expected of them in the situation. Maybe they had difficulty managing unstructured time, and that's what is occurring then, or just a poor concept of time. Often we see that it's the students who really struggle with communicating their needs or expressing their feelings, or there's that lack of social awareness, social expectations. There's a lack of awareness that what they're doing is even dangerous. There could also possibly be an insensitivity to pain or a sensitivity to pain, but there's a lot more that's happening than meets the eye. And for a lot of folks who are dealing with challenging behaviors, often they're reacting to just those things that they see without really trying to figure out what is happening underneath. So we want to focus on prevention. So what we're going to be talking about is how can we try to remove those triggers, try to remove those things that are even going to start an escalation from happening to begin with. What could be those setting events? What are some of those antecedents that we see before the behavior even occurs? So we want to think about, is everything in place that needs to be in place to make sure that we're removing the possibility of this problem behavior from escalating to begin with. And then we're thinking about what was the antecedent that resulted in the what we're seeing immediately after that behavior happened, that consequence. So we have lots of resources. We didn't want to spend a whole lot of time giving you things that you can access on your own depending on what the need is. So we're just thinking of general classroom considerations. In the file box that you can download in the bottom left corner, if you're not already familiar with our classroom assistance tool, that does a really nice job of getting a pulse of what's happening in the environment of the classroom, the behavior systems in the classroom, and curriculum and instruction. So if you're trying to support a teacher who needs help in any of those areas, that's a great first place to start. You can also access our MTSS Classroom Coaching Guide, and that's on our website, and you can follow that link. So those are some resources that are available to you. We also have some online chats that have been done in the past around this very issue of classroom environments. So you can look at the coaching guide, you can listen to a chat around instructional variables, curriculum variables, and environment. So those are some things that are there for you to access if you're a teacher or supporting teachers in that preventative piece. Oops, sorry. The other preventative piece, or the one of the means that we can use to stay in the calm phase, are thinking about our teacher interactions with students. And what I included here is a link to a video that talks about, has a teacher just talking about what he does to try to build relationships with students, especially students that he really struggles with connecting to. The video is real short, and I definitely recommend it. You can access the link from the PowerPoint that's also in your SharePod to just take a look at. Sometimes folks really struggle with connecting with students who have challenging behaviors, and he talks a little bit and gives some suggestions about how he can do that. The other recommendation that we've seen be real successful is a feelings check-in. And it doesn't have to be called that. It can be called whatever the teacher chooses. But when the students walk in the beginning of the day, he or she asks, where are they on a scale of 1 to 5? 5 meaning they feel great, they're ready to learn. 1 meaning that they're really feeling awful. They're not in a good mood. Today's just not been a good day. That gives teachers an indication of, if I'm at a 1 and I come in and I let you know that I'm in a 1 by holding up my fingers or by just telling you or writing it down, whatever that might look like, then as the teacher, I know that I'm going to need to follow up privately with that. And maybe that's not the time I'm going to start pushing getting on task right away. Instead, I'll get everybody else going and then follow up with that student later. It just gives me an indication of what are they walking into. Some teachers do this after lunch, especially if they struggle with whatever class they have directly after lunch. If something happened with other peers, if something happened with an adult, they can find that out simply by doing a real quick check-in. And students can either hold up their fingers or they could write it down, however the classroom feels like it fits best for them. Again, continuing on with teacher interactions with students. When we're in the calm phase, we want to reinforce that. We want to do everything we can to make sure that that on-task behavior continues. And we want to model the communication you want to see for the students. Many times I would hear teachers yelling at students to not yell at them, which is really difficult to do because you're not modeling what it is that you want to see. So sometimes, and we'll talk a little bit more about asking some clarifying questions, making sure that we're really thinking about reflection of our responses to problem behaviors. And by all means, we want to try to avoid those power struggles. So I included a link here that gave some really great suggestions of how to avoid power struggles. They give a couple different scenarios on that link on the website of exact ways that teachers have given directions or explained how they're going to react to problem behavior ahead of time. So for example, the teacher might say, I do notice if you're not on task, but I'm not going to stop my instruction right now to deal with it, but I will talk to you about it later. She says it to the whole entire class to really avoid that whole issue of I'm going to stop what I'm doing and engage in a struggle with you while trying to instruct my reading lesson. So I'm curious to know from you all, what are some strategies either you've personally used to avoid power struggles or you suggest teachers use to avoid power struggles? Because often that's what can escalate a student's behavior and also an adult's behavior. Okay, I see a couple people typing. Okay, the broken record technique. So Erin, can you talk a little bit more about what that is? and I'm just going to just pause while people type. I don't want anyone to think their audio went away. Okay, meeting students with one-on-one, yes, to get to the heart of the matter. That is a great way to avoid power struggles. Repeating a simple direction in the same tone of voice, right? You're not engaging with them as to why they're not following the direction. You're just staying consistent with what it is that you have already said. Good. I see a couple people adding a couple more ideas. Okay. A quiet voice response, removing from the room or a safe place in the room. And I think it's also important to think about if we're trying to prevent a power struggle, but we sense ourselves getting engaged in one, that sometimes we need to walk away from the situation as the adult. All right, I just see Paige typing, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Praise in public, correct in private. Great. And I think that's something that we can keep telling teachers and reminding teachers and all adults that that's really good frame mantra, I guess I would say, to praise in public, but to correct in private. Good. All right, great. It's as if you all have dealt with power struggles before. All right. So I briefly just referred to teachers' own behavior, and I think this is something that we don't spend enough time thinking about as the adults in the situation. I know when I was taught EBD, I was often very guilty of not considering my own triggers. But what we need to do is think about how can we help teachers identify what it is that triggers them. Because just as students have them, we have them too. So even those behaviors that really cause some irritation. And I was sharing that I taught in residential treatment for a while, and I could handle lots of different kinds of behaviors. Cursing did not bother me. A lot of things that maybe would set other adults off in traditional settings didn't frustrate me, but tapping the pencil frustrated me. And humming. Those two things really started to irritate me. And if I was already on the edge of maybe repeated myself 100 times or had one of those days, pencil tapping was a challenge. And I could always identify those body signals that it was causing irritation, so it started to be the only thing I could hear. So I really had to think about how am I going to address those. And if I can't get the student to stop tapping their pencil and that became a power struggle, then I needed to think of something else to do. And that was a conversation that I had to have with a particular student because he wasn't even aware he was doing it. And I wasn't even aware of how much it was irritating me. So we had a conversation of how can we come to a place where you can keep tapping and it's not going to bother me. And we actually came up with the idea of putting a little cushion pad on the tip of his desk so he could just tap there. I didn't hear it. He was content with doing it, and it just made the whole day a lot smoother. So the other thing we want to continue thinking about are those calming strategies. So taking deep breaths, counting to 5 before responding, or delaying our response until we feel better. Another resource that's a really great article to share with folks is the link at the bottom. So it's talking about building your resilience to your own triggers. And the one I gave was sort of a funny example, but it's at the same time, we all have things that can start to irritate us and can actually start us to respond in ways that aren't ideal. Okay. So we want to think about the fact that there are student triggers. Maybe it's that a student was corrected by a teacher. There are also those setting events that happen before anything else occurred. So maybe they came back from lunch because and they're upset because there was a negative interaction with a peer or a teacher. Maybe they're tired or hungry or the environment's chaotic. And when we think about teacher trigger, a student talks back and maybe one day it doesn't bother you, but the next day it does because you had your own setting events. Maybe you had a negative interaction with a colleague or with a student. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're hungry, or maybe the environment's really chaotic for you. So oftentimes those setting events can be the same and they can be our own triggers, and we need to be aware of what those are and really reflect on ourselves as the adults of, is this really about the student talking back, or is this because I had all these other things happen before I even got to the point of the student talking back. Okay. So this is a trigger that as an example, maybe you have a student who consistently makes squeaky noise with his desk, okay? And the teacher's repeatedly told the student to stop, but the student continues. And the teacher just decides he's doing it on purpose and then gives him consequences for not following the directions. The student continues to make the desk squeak. Then it turns into a whole event. So how might you see this situation play itself out? I continue to tell you to stop making it squeak. You continue to do it. I give you consequences. You continue to do it. Then what might you think how would this situation typically end? Or how could it potentially end? Okay, it could escalate to more severe behavior, right? So we're talking about the fact that I'm getting angry as a student because I don't even know that I'm making it squeak. You're getting mad at me because I think you're doing it on purpose. As the teacher, I keep telling you to stop, and I perceive that you're not following directions, and then it continues and it escalates. Okay, maybe it moves seats, maybe it's a removal from the room, maybe I'm now sent to the office, right? The teacher calls for assistance, the student's removed. I get so frustrated from as the student, I get so frustrated from the teacher telling me over and over again to stop doing something that I'm not even aware that I'm doing. So what about if I see a couple more people typing, and we're going to try to show you a quick video. All right, good. So somebody's had the suggestion to ask the kid if they are aware. So we're going to watch a quick video of a better way to handle those kinds of little situations that tend to escalate into very big problems.
Bob, does that desk have to make that noise? Well, stand here, I want to show you something. Watch this. If you sit in this desk like this, push this all the way out, and then you can sit here and you can move, and when it's pushed all the way out, then your feet can be on the floor and it doesn't make that noise. See, even when I write. Try it. So it's pushed in. What if it's pushed in? Now push it out all the way. Okay, now write. Show me. It doesn't squeak, does it? Okay, that's exactly the way to do it. Good job.
Were you all able to hear that? Yes, good. Okay. All right, great. So we see there that he took the time, he taught what it was he wanted to see, and then we can just prevent that from ever being a trigger from here on out. So we have them model it, he practiced it, it took 2 seconds, right? Not very long, and then the problem was solved. It could have very easily escalated into something more serious. So here are just some examples for us to consider of triggers. We talked about conflict with adults or peers. It could be a non-preferred activity, and oftentimes those are an academic subject area for students. But it could also be non-school related. Maybe I'm hungry or tired, or I came to school because there was a conflict at home. And that's where that feeling check-in does a good job for us to get a sense of those things that we don't see that's what's happening right in front of us. Are there any other student triggers that you all see in your work with students or with schools? Right, bus rides, yes, that's a huge trigger, right? We know a lot of times kids have had some kind of interaction on the bus that started off their day in a very negative way. Test anxiety, we're seeing more and more and more at younger and younger ages, right? If there's a change in schedule I'm not aware of, or I walk in and my teacher's not there. If I'm sick, yes. If I have sensory issues, those are real hard things for us to know without somebody telling us. Things going on at home in transitions, yes. So there's a lot of different things that could potentially be triggers for students. So if we can remove them, great. If we can't, then we need to actually practice that behavior we want to see. So a very simple example was the chair and the desk, but we want to think about if we know something's a trigger, we know a non-preferred activity is about to happen, we're going to practice before that even happens of what it is we want to see. We can use pre-correction. We can try to change the conditions. Can we change the location or the time? Can we consider any of those? And then what's our level or frequency of reinforcement? When we do see those things happening that we want to see, when traditionally before we saw it to be a trigger, we want to make sure that we're reinforcing it at a rate that's really productive. So this quick example that I'm going to show you is a pre-correction prior to lunch. So this teacher knows that this one student often has trouble when he is transitioning to lunch. So she's recognized this and she's going to talk with him. So I'll just show you an example of her addressing the whole class and then addressing him.
It looks like it's about time for lunch. I want to remind you of our expectations in the hallway. You need to walk to the lunchroom quietly. Go ahead and put your things away, and you can head to the lunchroom. Michael, you put your notebook away and get out your board. I just want to remind you, expectations in the hallway are to walk quietly. Can you point to the one walking quietly? Great job. Go ahead and go to the lunchroom.
And that was a student who has autism. So he had a board, and she was referring to that. So that's a tool that he uses a lot, but she was trying to pre-correct before they even got to, had a chance for him to struggle with that transition. If you're looking for some more video examples, they're all just as short as that. You can go to this link, and there's lots of different examples, more like the one I showed you before of teaching the child how to sit in the desk, and then more along the lines of this as well. So there's different age groups and different examples of strategies there, and they're all really short and really quick. Okay, we can also provide a behavioral reminder. So we signal to the students to remember the rules, or maybe we have a visual or a nonverbal. And we also can make environmental adjustments, so we can change the location in the classroom prior to a non-preferred activity, or move to an area of the classroom with different peers if we think that that's something that could address the trigger before it would even happen. So just quickly, an example, again, we're going back to Tasha and to math, because she gets real agitated and she gets up and walks around and she wants all her friends around her to also be off task. So before math even comes up, before that independent time comes up, the teacher and Tasha have reviewed a visual reminder that's on her desk of what those transition procedures are, and she makes eye contact with Tasha and gives her a thumbs up as a sign of encouragement. So she doesn't have to stop everything she's doing. The teacher can walk over, point to the visual, and then make eye contact with a thumbs up. Environmentally, the teacher and Tasha have identified an alternate spot in the class where she can do independent work that would help her stay on task. The key here is she talked with Tasha about it ahead of time, and they practiced it, and they made sure that it fit what worked for both of them. Tasha didn't want a loud reminder in front of the whole class, but something that's quiet and also something where she's allowed to change her spot could help her from engaging in those behaviors that have escalated for her in the past. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
All right. So all these things that Anna just shared here in this first half are wonderful strategies that we could use to, as proactive strategies to address behavior prior to the point of this agitation. So using this crisis cycle as a guide for our chat here today, we covered all of this stuff that happens here in the Plan A. Now, unfortunately, we can't prevent everything. And sometimes there's that escalation. If you remember from that early slide, hopefully 98% of the time, give or take, we're in here, but sometimes things escalate. And that's what we're going to talk about here in these next slides. So as students, as we start to see increased agitation, escalation, they go from calm to use these technical terms, irritated or cross. There are a lot of strategies that teachers can employ to try to turn things around, thinking about this right here, going back to that Plan A without going through this roller coaster ride with the student. What we want to do is avoid that thermometer from blowing up. So a lot of what Anna provided here was in crisis prevention. So here we're doing a lot of planning around how are we setting up the environment, and we're teaching skills to students to help them to be able to be part of this process of proactively addressing behavior. Now in crisis de-escalation, we move from this planning to awareness. So what's going on in the environment? What can I do as part of the environment to help turn things around so that we don't go into a crisis situation? And those skills that are being taught could be prompted there. If there are skills that the students might use to help turn things around, or our own skills. And then if we can't, then we move into more of a safety prompting, and not necessarily the skills, but just making sure that there's calm. But there's a lot that we can do in that middle phase. Let me start here by just defining what we're talking about with verbal de-escalation, since that's the topic of our chat here today. Verbal de-escalation is a targeted intervention for use with students who are at risk for aggression. It's basically using calm language along with other communication techniques to diffuse, redirect, or de-escalate a conflict situation. And that's from Karen Nelson, 2010. And so you pick out here a couple of key words. It's targeted intervention. What we're talking about, as we had that disclaimer at the very beginning, this is not to replace a safety plan. It's also not to replace a person's individual behavior intervention plan or some function-based intervention that was developed specifically for that student. These are good rules of thumb, but not a replacement for those things. And a lot of this has to do with still communication. We're not talking about physical intervention here, nor should we be. I'm going to share a quick video here, and this will illustrate just a quick example of escalating behavior in the classroom. Sharing.
Shane, would you work that problem for me? Who'd like to work it? Okay. Okay, nice work. Problem 2. Shane. I don't even know what page we're on. We're on page 47. Why don't you have a seat in the back of the room? With your math book. Who'd like to work problem 2? Anybody? Okay. Is that correct, Shane? Shane, is that correct? Hey, we're not going to go on until you answer me. Is it correct? I'm not playing your stupid game. Excuse me, I need you to have a seat. Shane, don't walk away from me. Shane.
Okay, Shane. So I'm going to have you the chat box. What are the things? What are the things that the teacher did there that escalated the behavior for Shane, and what would you have used to avoid that incident from occurring? The behavior repeatedly made Shane lose face in front of his peers, certainly drawing attention to him, arguing. So what are some things that he could have done? Don't pull things out of students' hands or touch them when they're trying to walk away. Certainly a great, yes, great observation there. Could have ignored the behavior. Excellent. Some of this goes back to what people shared earlier about we praise in public, and we otherwise address the behavior in private. And certainly that was in front of all the rest of the class, and Shane, yes, lost face with that. Just motion to the student to put away. Exactly.
And the other piece was he was watching when the student went up and fixed the problem. He watched her. He was engaged for a moment, and the teacher sort of blew it by really trying to get him, force the issue. Yeah. He wasn't going to let it go that Shane didn't follow the directions.
Great observation there. Well, so a big part of this when dealing with the challenging behavior is the teacher's behavior. And a big part of that is how we, as people who are providing that support and teaching, are interpreting what's going on. And so this is something that's important, not just to talk about right now. And I'm sure that this is nothing new to anybody here, but to keep this in your and rehearse this and be thinking about this as a mantra, that you replace these upsetting thoughts around these interactions, the student is a monster, these sort of loaded words. And some of you may have hopefully have not heard too many of these words in team meetings and other meetings, but I'm sure that you hear these when referring to certain students. Sick of putting out fires, he'll never change, and replacing some of that with thoughts that are more, instead of taking that control away from the teacher, really putting control in the hands of the teacher to be able to affect change, teach new skills. My job's to stay calm and help him to learn better ways to behave, or her, help her to learn more appropriate behaviors, that sort of thing. And there are a variety of things that we could do and rehearse, or if you're in a coaching role, that you can help teachers to rehearse and practice as part of this these de-escalation strategies. So first off, giving the person your undivided attention. That doesn't mean what that teacher did with Shane and staying focused verbally on what he was doing wrong. Clarifying statements and questions, and we'll give some examples of a few of these here. Summarizing and paraphrasing using empathy. And remember, and you all brought this up when I shared that example, that silence is okay. You don't have to respond to behavior. And sometimes if you see that you're getting involved in a power struggle, then silence might be the best recourse. So clarifying statements and questions, what are we talking about with that? It's good to have, especially if this could be helpful for specific students, to have a few of these at the ready, and to practice this so that you're well versed. So things like, you're not in trouble. This is a chance for me to hear your side of the story. Let's figure out what to do together in a positive way. I want to understand what happened and how to respond. Or clarifying. So what do you need right now to calm yourself? Do you need a moment to yourself, or like to talk? These are some clarifying questions. Could also use paraphrasing. Let me repeat back to you what I heard you say. From what I understand, you're upset about what happened at lunch. Is that correct? My understanding is you're frustrated with this assignment and need to take a break. Would you agree with this? And using empathy, I would be upset too if someone called me a name. I can understand how frustrated you must be when you had your hand in the air, but I wasn't able to come over right away. I understand this is very important to you. Let's figure out what to do next. These are just a few examples. Maybe you know of some other listening skills or strategies that have been effective with some students that you know, or you've seen some of these in action. If we just, let's take just a minute or two, and if you have a good example, go ahead and share it in the chat box. Allow the student to go to a calm down space, sure. And have that set up in advance, right? So it's not, doesn't come across as a reactive, go do this now, but something that's practiced. And yes, so yes, it is something that's set up in advance. And we see what Janelle has to say, and then we'll move on here. With one of my ASD kids, if our time is almost up and we need to move on to something new, I always speak privately with her and say, I know you aren't done yet, but we'll have more time to work on this, and then specify a time. That's great. So again, that's a privately prompting and recognizing that that's something that she wants to do. And so there's some empathy there that, hey, this is a good time to do it. Post-it note on the student's desk to go get water, use the restroom. It's great. Break cards, yes. All right, let's move on here. So If one of these strategies works, either one of the ones that was listed here, but any strategy, if any strategy you find really works for diffusing one of those situations when it starts to escalate, definitely make note of those strategies. We too often just document those incidents in which things didn't work and then things escalated, but we need to document these things so that we can share it and that we can be consistent with it and develop a plan with the student cooperatively, involve them in that, give them some ownership of that, anticipate those situations, and provide reminders in subtle ways. And you just shared a few really nice subtle ways of reminding the student of that plan, to take a break and what you'd be doing with that, and then practice those as needed. So that's that beginning of the escalation right here. So there's a trigger, there's some bumps in the road and then a trigger and some escalation. Now we know that doesn't always work. And so when that doesn't and things escalate to the point of crisis, we can still diffuse, we can still verbally de-escalate the situation. And it doesn't necessarily need to involve some kind of physical redirection. Now at this point, or even during escalation, what we're talking about is not teaching new skills. Now, teaching new skills is a vital part of this process, but we can't be teaching the skills during that time. Hopefully these skills are already taught when the student's calm, and then we're prompting those things calmly and in a way that works for the student. So there are different crisis response choices, and there are different crisis response choices, from no verbal or physical redirection, that's silence, verbal redirection, positioning. Those all involve no physical hands-on of any sort and are least intrusive. And then moving into deflection, or some programs might call it blocking, evasion, and then finally restraint and seclusion. Now I think about this as a continuum of crisis response, that you can have a crisis response and it still involves no restraint or seclusion. At this point, if the student is in crisis, and I hear this sometimes from teachers and other staff about, well, they're just trying to get out of the assignment. Now, if I give them a break, am I just reinforcing the behavior? If it gets to the point where the student is so escalated that there's going to be that there's some danger, then they're not at a place where we're not worried so much about reinforcing and punishing. Hopefully, in future circumstances, we would be building those other alternatives in and reinforcing those, but we're really concerned about safety. Now, I brought up restraint and seclusion. There are a number of issues with this. And of course, this should be the last course of action, which is why we're really focused here on verbal de-escalation. Primarily, it's costly to both the student and to the teacher. It's very demeaning to the student. It puts them in a situation where they're no longer in control physically in any way. They're no longer in control. There's a risk of physical injury to both the teacher and the student. And most importantly, it doesn't adequately change behavior. It's just a recourse for maintaining health and safety. So keep this in mind, because you know that it can be very time consuming to put in these proactive strategies, but that time invested, if you have a student that engages in crisis behavior, will save time in the long run, in that you're not having to respond to behavior, or the teachers that you support are not having to respond to behavior. So during crisis, as with escalation, we want to be aware of stance, posturing, hands, eyes, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second, though some of this should be specified in your crisis plan, and sometimes in the individual's plan of support if they're somebody who engages in some really challenging behavior, and there's certain things that need to be known about that person that might be specified in their plan. So you're not too close, but you're close enough to protect health and safety. And we're never threatening the use of physical intervention as a consequence. I want to share this with you really briefly. And Some crisis intervention courses talk about this, but not all. There's a fight, flight, and freeze response that if a person's escalated enough, they might fall into just as a matter of self-preservation. And when we're talking about fight, flight, and freeze and that escalation, we're not just talking about students here. We're talking about staff who might experience this. And anytime you feel like you're in danger, where you feel that your safety is threatened, you may have this response. Fight doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to go get in a fight. Flight doesn't mean I'm going to necessarily physically run out of the room. Freeze doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to stop everything that I'm doing, but that there's more of an aggressive move in fight with a single-mindedness towards ending whatever that is that's a danger. Again, trying to get away with flight, and maybe not physically, but in maybe in more subtle ways, but it's a flight response. And there's less thinking involved here and more reacting. And so as teachers, we need to, or if you're a coach, what you need to be thinking about when helping teachers through this is that when you're working with somebody who is escalating themselves and may engage in some challenging behavior, there's a real risk that you may escalate with that person, and you may find that you're going into this fight, flight, or freeze response. Now, with that, breathing changes, vision changes, speech changes, thinking, passage of time, body language. And note here that with thinking, you're looking at reduced thinking across the board, where you're just not thinking as clearly. And that's the reason why we need to really be thinking about this in advance, not in the moment, but practicing, working on, as Anna described earlier in that first half, those plans for maintaining your own calm in a difficult situation, that you're practicing those things. You're aware of your breathing, and maybe your breathing gets shallower, and I need to take some deep breaths if I'm dealing with somebody who's escalated, so that I don't find that I start to go into a fight or flight response. Now, as you practice this, there are a few things to think about, specifically around language and body posturing. First off, with that cartoon on the side, calm down, crazy face. The guy's fists are clenched, and he's making a grimacing look, if you can interpret it that way. This is not what we're suggesting here. We want, if the person's in crisis, remember that thinking is reduced, and we want simple and short sentences about what the person should be doing and not what they shouldn't be doing. This is even if we need to verbally respond at all. And our tone is not aggressive. We're consistent with what we're saying across situations, and the people are consistent in how they're responding. It's really vital in these sort of situations. And if you find that you're escalating with a student, or the student is targeting you, that it could be really helpful to switch off with somebody else, so that there's somebody else who is providing that direction, that the person's hearing a different voice. Rephrasing versus just repeating over and over what you need the person to do, and allowing time for a response for the person. Again, remembering that they might not respond as quickly, and then providing alternative choices when possible. Also, body language should be relaxed and not seeming aggressive. Remember that a lot of our communication is nonverbal, and so we need to make sure that what we're expressing when we're dealing with somebody who's agitated already is not an aggressive posture. So we don't have our hands clenched or our arms folded or against our hips, and our eye contact is not glaring at the person or aggressive, but not totally avoidant either. And that we're aware of personal space needs at this point. Maybe you're needing to be in a position to respond, but you're not getting right in the person's face. You're certainly not physically interacting with the person, as that in that last video that teacher did when they were leaving the room, as that could potentially escalate that situation even more. Remember that limited processing, that the person may not be hearing every word. And so if you're saying what you don't want them to do or what you want them to not do, they might just hear throw the chair versus put the chair down, calm down. So following the crisis is also vitally important. Talk about debriefing. We don't want to revisit this with the person until they're fully calm. And so there should be a plan if the person does go into crisis a fair amount of how often or how long the person, and how you could tell when the person's calm enough to be ready to talk about the situation. Also, you need to make sure that you're fully calm because, again, in those situations, you will All right, so lastly, monitoring and practice. Yeah.
So I also just wanted to mention in the file share pod at the bottom left, there's 4 resources on restorative chats, which is just one restorative practice. But there's some really good guidelines and questions to have that conversation. A lot of times we have crisis situations that happen in our classroom, and if we're called for assistance and that student is removed from the room, we still need to process when they come back in because a crisis has happened. And I am a person. I'm the adult, but I'm also a person who was involved in this situation. And maybe I got cursed at, or maybe I had something thrown at me. And the student is also removed from the room. And we talked about saving face earlier. It's really hard to enter back into the room, not sure how the adult's going to respond to you. I know a lot of times we hear the adults say, I'm not ready for them to come back. Or they say something demeaning or something that really makes the student feel worse about what happened. So those restorative, they're just tip sheets. But there's some really good information to have a productive conversation to acknowledge what happened.
Yeah. So I wanted to leave a couple of minutes for questions, but just really quickly, I just have a couple slides left. And I already mentioned it's really important to practice these control plans. It's also really important to practice all of these pieces here around noting your own agitation levels and monitoring response, all these skills that are in here. And as a coach, you could remind teachers and staff about these issues, that they will accelerate with others, that it's important to practice these plans, and that these sort of practices can happen in groups as well as other skills that can be practiced in groups. So, again, after we go through this, when we have a plan in place, that we're constantly evaluating, redefining, making sure that what we're doing is effective, and if not, that we're able to adjust it and change our plan accordingly. So that brings us to, we just have a couple minutes for questions.
Or if there was a resource that you were looking for or an idea that you were looking for that we didn't cover, you could type that in the chat box as well. We want to make sure that people are walking away with the information that they were looking for. Or if you have any strategies or you have any resources that you've used to support teachers or support classrooms or schools in crisis prevention and also intervention, feel free to share those as well. People are always looking for ideas that have worked in other schools. So we'll give folks a chance to type some of that in before we do our final poll of the day. I definitely encourage you to look back through the PowerPoint at some of the links that we provided. So does that say 2x10 strategy for prevention and building relationships? Paige, can you talk a little bit more about that so everybody knows what you mean?
2x10.
And I see a couple other folks are typing. And I know a lot of times we think that building relationships is a natural thing that happens in classrooms, but not always. If you go down, Janet, to the file pod that's right below the chat box, the PowerPoint is in there. You might just have
down here.
You might just have to scroll through some of that. I think, Maria, it's great to practice in groups too, because it's not something we talk about and practice very frequently. So it's really hard to do in a crisis situation to even remember some of those strategies without having some
Absolutely.
practice to them.
Now, some people's individual plans might be a little different because they respond differently in that sort of situation. And so we all might have our own slightly different plan, but it's okay to talk and practice in groups. And certainly that will encourage people because not everybody will see a value in doing that. But if you deal with enough with challenging, aggressive behavior, then you find that it is very useful to practice.
So Paige, that's a really great idea in general for all students. I think it's for teachers to do with all students. But for 10 days in a row, you meet with a student for 2 minutes, but you don't talk about behavior or academics. You just build that relationship. Yeah, if you don't mind sharing that, we can make sure that we post that along with this chat. I think that sounds like a terrific idea and a terrific resource. Thank you. I see a couple more folks typing. And of course, building that relationship is such a good preventative piece. And that's true. I mean, we have to admit there are students. We're not going to like everybody who walks through our door. So we really need to think about how are we going to build a relationship with that student.
Absolutely.
Instead of letting everything they do trigger us. All right. Yeah, we know what you meant. We know that you meant it with peace and with love. All right. So while folks are still typing, 5 positive interactions for every correction, that's a great ratio.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, definitely try that restorative chat because it does talk about both feelings of both the student and the adult, and has them really engage in that conversation. I think as the adult, we sometimes don't think about it, and as the student, we don't always think about how what we did impacted other people in the room. There's a lot of great resources on community building where they have the discussions as a whole class. Of course, that's, again, depends on your classroom, depends on your style, but I definitely encourage you to explore more of that. Because a lot of times the other students don't know what to do after a crisis happens as well. It's scary. It can be very scary for lots of people involved. Discipline that restores. Great. Quick read. Good. Good. So there's some good resources. I'm glad that you all were able to share. Keep typing. We just want to make sure that we do our final poll before we leave, so we can just get ideas. And again, too, if there's something that you were looking for that we didn't share today, please either let your TA person know or type it in here, and we'll make sure that we get you the information that you need. So let me just clear the results. Okay, so just to let us know if today's chat was helpful or not. And if you felt like it wasn't, then just, again, make sure that you let us know so we can make you get your needs met there.